I'm Mike Papantonio, and this is Ring of Fire. Wall Street bankers and hedge fund managers make millions and even billions of dollars every year for producing nothing of value at all for this economy. All this happens while American workers watch their paychecks decline as their productivity actually increases. We'll take a look at that disparity with author Les Leopold. Faulty medical devices, well, they've been flooding the American market for years with little to no federal oversight. We'll be taking a look at the failures of both the industry and the regulatory agencies that allow products on the market that are killing and crippling American citizens. And defense contractors have stolen billions of dollars from the federal government in recent years, but our leaders in Washington continue to award those people millions of dollars in federal contracts every year. We'll be taking a look at the criminal history of some of the largest U.S. defense firms in just a minute. Right now, you've just entered the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
If there's one group of people less trustworthy than the host of Fox News, it's got to be the U.S. defense contractors. In just the last few years, we've seen them steal billions of dollars from our federal government through fraud, lies, and sometimes outright theft. So why does the federal government keep awarding multi-billion-dollar contracts to these criminals? Let's see if we can find an answer to that question with two of the best attorneys in America, Howard Nations and Michael Berg. So right now, guys, what we have is we have the federal government almost enabling defense contractors at this point by continuing to pay them money after they've had to fine Lockheed and Northrop and Raytheon and everybody the government is giving money to. These are companies that have already paid huge civil fines and huge criminal fines for defrauding the American public. But nevertheless, day one, we take their money for being criminals. In day two, we give them a government contract. Isn't that about how you see it, Howard?
Well, it is, Mike. And the problem here is that this is so endemic in the system. It goes all the way back. If you take KBR, for example, who's one of the most egregious offenders, the B in KBR is for Brown. It was Brown and Root Construction Company, which merged with Kellogg. Brown was the man who in the 30s and 40s had all the political connections with Washington. He's the guy that a young fellow by the name of Lyndon Johnson came to when he wanted to run for the United States Senate. And he got George R. Brown's backing. And then when Johnson became Senate Majority Leader, Vice President, and President, George R. Brown and this entire crew, Kellogg and Brown and Root Construction Company and later Halliburton, just got a locked-in position with the Defense Department and the federal government, and it's never changed since. And
well, Howard, let me ask you something. This is the same company, if you recall, where you had you might remember the Jamie Lee Jones story, where they had this young employee working for KBR that was gang raped. And after she was gang raped by employees of KBR, not just employees, but actually management employees for KBR, she was then secreted away into a storage container. She was unconscious, actually almost in a coma, was bleeding profusely, had been raped by several different KBR employees, and they intended to get rid of her body. Now, we know that happened. And we know the story unfolded right before the American public's eyes, right before our senators and congressmen's eyes. But then our government then turns around and gives KBR another contract. Rather than punishing for this event, they give them another contract. Why is it that KBR has this special route to our taxpayer money?
Well, because they're completely locked into the politicians and the military personnel who control the contracts. And they have been locked in for decades, and they're not going to lose that kind of power over such things as lawsuits that they have to defend. And regardless of how egregious their conduct is, they will have a major egregious act And then within months or within a year, they'll get major billion-dollar contracts. And that's a cycle, and it's not going to stop. There's absolutely nothing on the horizon that would cause this to come to an end.
Michael Berg, at this point, we know this. We know that hundreds of defense contractors have been, we've proven that they've defrauded the government to the tune of $1.1 trillion just in the past decade. But nevertheless, the Pentagon continues to do business with the people who have stolen these trillions of dollars, and it's just business as usual. There seems to be nothing in the way of allowing a defense contractor to steal as much as they want and then go to work for the government on some special kind of contract. You've watched this develop. What's your take on it?
Well, what's really crazy here is that, the American public doesn't realize that these companies who are being fined in many cases, millions and millions of dollars for their conduct, that they get rewarded and they continue to be on the list to get these contracts and are being rewarded with billions of dollars. Right here in Colorado, Lockheed Martin, for example, was fined over $11 million, and the following year they were awarded $30 billion worth of contracts. It's just outrageous, and I think Howard hit the nail on the head when he said they are so locked into the politicians in the Department of Defense that the American people have to say something and really stand up and stop this, because it's the taxpayers who end up paying for this kind of fraud.
Michael, Raytheon is a story that we're seeing in the press right now, where we understand now that Raytheon has its own sordid history of paying paying hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines for things like fraud, concealment, actually just flat out lying to the government about doing work that they never did, just on and on with this history of Raytheon, that if you take a look, anybody watching this program could in 15 minutes figure out just how sordid that history is. But right now we have Raytheon working on a special project, again, that as a defense contractor, government's probably going to end up paying for. Tell us about that project.
Well, now, Raytheon's a unique situation, and I think, Mike, one of the things we have to really recognize is they've already been found guilty of illegally acquiring confidential and secret Air Force and Pentagon documents, which is unbelievable. They are working on a project now they call it Riot, and be honestly, maybe the American people ought to riot over this project, because what they're doing is they've got a secret spyware which they link into your Facebook account, your iPad, your iPhone, your computer, and they gather data about American citizens. And they're spying on American citizens, and they own this privately, and they're doing it under a defense contract with the DoD, Department of Defense. But the scary part of this whole thing is what are they going to do with this information? Number one, should they be allowed to collect the information? They were bragging about the part that they could tell where people are going, where they've been, where they expect them to be. If you go work out in the morning at 6 o'clock, they can find you. And it opens up the potential. And this is 1984 Orwell on steroids.
Okay, well, isn't the problem here with a setting like that is we know that government obviously is not willing to do anything about defense contractors stealing trillions of dollars. I mean, that's the number. That's not our number. That's the Department of Justice saying this is how much money has been stolen by way of fraud, by way of completely just outright theft. This is the number. So we know the number, and government obviously has nothing in place to stop it. How does the private individual do anything about it?
Well, the private individual cannot do very much about it because it is so totally endemic within the process. For example, if you look back at the situation with Halliburton, when Cheney became Secretary of Defense, Halliburton got just the inside track on absolutely everything, to the extent that they didn't have it. And I understand KBR and Halliburton were all in bed together on this thing at the time. And when the neocons took over, and they had the
You're talking about Iraq when they took over.
Send out
when they
all
took
the
over.
contracts they want. They immediately started when with Cheney they got no bid, no competition, contracts. And they managed to get incredible contracts that were so far beyond the pale. And you're talking about the $1.1 trillion that's been basically stolen through fraud and so forth. A major portion of the losses in Iraq were to Halliburton. And the reason nobody can do anything about it is because of the connections. The president of Halliburton was Dick Cheney. When Dick Cheney got the nomination for vice president, Halliburton gave him a $38 million bonus before he took office as vice president. He in turn gave them no competition contracts. This is a company, Halliburton, who actually sold pulse neuron generators to detonate nuclear weapons to Libya.
Yeah, in other
Does
words,
anything happen from that? No consequence.
Howard,
to that whatsoever.
Howard, let me be clear. Let me be clear about that story. First of all, the government said, A, we're not doing business with Libya, and B, you certainly don't want to be selling them weapons, but this is a company that decided to sell them weapons that could detonate nuclear bombs. And then even after that, we find out that we're still doing business with Halliburton's. We're still doing business with the KBRs. Michael, let me flip over to you on this. KBR, I don't know if you saw this story where they were found guilty of negligence for basically poisoning soldiers in the field with sodium dichromate. Did you follow that story, and what's your reaction to it?
We did follow it completely, and Mike, let me just tell you, first of all, it's unbelievable that they first of all lied to the troops over there and told them this was just orange sand, it would just be an irritant. But the worst part about it is after there was a lawsuit filed in Oregon, and they were held liable for $96 million plus fees and costs.
For that event.
Exactly, and what they did was they then brought out a secret agreement they had with the Department of Defense in which they were immune and indemnified, and now are looking to get the taxpayers to pay that judgment and their attorney's fees, which will be well over $100 million.
Mike, let me put this in perspective. This was a case where you had KBR that was contracted to do a water treatment facility over in Iraq. And they told the soldiers that, listen, if you use this, if you work around this facility, everything's going to be okay. The chemicals that you're using might be just a mild irritant, but in fact, they were carcinogens, and you've already had soldiers dying because of it. But now KBR wants taxpayers to pay for that. We're going to take a break. We'll pick up with the criminal nature of defense contractors and what individuals can do about it. I'm Mike Papantonio, and we're talking with Howard Nations and Michael Berg. This is Ring of Fire. We'll be right back.
To a political coup taking place right in front of your damn eyes. That caliber of evil needed to be held accountable in courtrooms. Billionaire mad money wasn't enough to buy democracy. Legislators don't have enough sense to think for themselves. They let Alec do it.
Here at Ring of Fire, the truth is our only agenda, so we're able to bring you the stories that mainstream media just ignored or completely got wrong. Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. We've been talking today about the crimes being committed by the defense contractors working for the federal government. And we've been trying to figure out why our government continues to hire these corrupt criminal corporations, giving millions and millions of dollars in federal contracts every year. I'm back with Howard Nations and Michael Berg. Howard, let me ask you, you were talking before the break about the idea of how a whistleblower avenue in America may be the only way to solve the corruption problem. Tell us about it.
Well, Mike, this is not a new problem. The original False Claims Act was promulgated by Abraham Lincoln in 1863 and passed by the Congress because contractors in the Civil War were defrauding and overcharging the Union government for the services that they were rendering. They were even doing such things as mixing sawdust into gunpowder. So Lincoln was incensed by this, came up with the False Claims Act. The problem with that one was there were too many hurdles for the whistleblower to jump over in order to prosecute successfully, and there were not enough incentives for the whistleblower. So not much really happened on False Claims Act until 1986 when it was amended. At that time, they made it much more lucrative for the whistleblowers to come forth. They were much more motivated to do so because they were also protected under the Act. So since that time, whistleblowers have done more good in prosecuting these contractors and bringing these contractors to account than any other single aspect of the government.
Matter of fact, $9 billion was collected last year just from corporations and that had committed fraud against taxpayers.
Yes.
So, but here's the problem, isn't it, Howard? Nobody goes to jail. How is it that corporations can steal $1.1 trillion from the United States taxpayers, from the Pentagon, and nobody goes to jail? In other words, if they robbed a bank, they'd go to jail. If they committed any other kind of crime, they would go to jail. But here we have corporations. We can figure out who made the decisions, can't we? We can just trace the money and understand who made these decisions to steal from the federal government. But we have a U.S. Justice Department that's been very slow to put people in jail for this type of crime, haven't they?
Yes, and nobody is prosecuting these folks criminally. When they do get prosecuted criminally, it's done with a criminal fine. And those criminal fines are really totally a slap on the wrist for these multi-billion-dollar corporations with their multi-billion-dollar contracts. Not only that, even when they do get hit, this is infuriating. But to follow up on what Mike Berg was saying about the situation with KBR, they got hit for $100 million by an Oregon jury, an $85 million verdict, $15 million in attorney's fees and legal expenses. For killing soldiers, 8 soldiers died and were poisoned and are slowly dying now from cancer. And even with a jury verdict, with them finding that they poisoned our soldiers, they still they don't want to pay it. They are coming back against the taxpayers to get that $100 million back under these indemnification agreements that are so secret. I've never heard of this before.
Yeah.
Indemnification agreements so secret that even the attorneys and the Department of Justice could not see them.
Yeah.
That kind of links they have are incredible.
Howard, the truth is Mike did get it right when he said, Mike Berg, let me ask you this. You were talking about the idea that we have now a situation where a corporation can kill American soldiers and still, pay no money. Howard just described a situation where a jury came back, they came up with a verdict, and now the KBR is saying taxpayers must pay that. Nobody with KBR goes to jail. There's no criminal case here. There's plenty for a criminal case, but nobody's prosecuted. And Michael Berg, let me ask you this. If you were to go back and just give us a quick summary of the type of fraud, just in a thumbnail sketch of how bad the fraud is and how much we're losing as taxpayers, give us a quick rundown.
Well, if you look at the statistics, they're over the last 10 years, for those companies, over 100 companies that have had civil penalties against them that have been anywhere from millions to tens of millions of dollars, what's happened is over $500 billion has been awarded to those contractors after they have pled to these civil penalties. With regard to criminal penalties, which, as Howard mentioned, are very, very slap on the wrist, there's been almost $400 billion awarded to these companies. That's outrageous. They should be taken off the list. they should not be allowed to bid any more on these contracts. And we're talking about some of the most lucrative. For example, like I said earlier, you've got Lockheed Martin here in Colorado. They were hit with almost $11 million fine. The next year, they were awarded a $30 billion contract with the Department of Defense. They should have been off the list. Grumman had a $19 million fine. They got over $25 billion. Michael, this has to stop. This country, as we know, a lot of rhetoric coming out about the debt that we have, and here we are allowing these criminal companies who have pled guilty to both civil and criminal violations are going forward and ripping off false claims, false documentation, and are now getting rewarded with billions and billions of dollars worth of contracts. It's outrageous.
Howard, the quick list that strikes me is you had the Pentagon paid almost $600 billion in the past 10 years to more than 300. Now, again, $600 billion paid in the past 10 years to 300 contractors, defense contractors, that were involved in civil fraud. They had already pled and said, we committed civil fraud. Then you had another $250 million went to 54 contractors, and this is unbelievable to me. But $250 million went to contractors, 54 contractors, who said, not only did we steal from you, we engaged in hardcore criminal fraud. Right. And the government still said, you know what? That's okay. For example, Lockheed Martin 2008, as Mike pointed out, $11 million, and the government the next year comes back and says, you know what? We're going to give you a $30 billion contract. How does it ever end if you have a Justice Department that doesn't recognize what crime is? Isn't that part of the problem here?
Well, there's one bright light on the horizon in that Senator Wyden has proposed that the indemnity agreements that we were talking about be made public, and that they be required to be justified by agreement with Congress. So right now the military does these totally secret, totally secret indemnification agreements. Those have got to stop. Senator Wyden's on that, requiring full disclosure and justification agreement with Congress before that can be done. And then the other thing that's happening is Senator Sanders, Bernie Sanders, is all over this report that came out that was the source of this information. But at the bottom line, where it stops is when the people who have the information within these corporations, the people who have inside information, when they come forward and become a whistleblower, when they come forward, step up and say, enough, this is way past enough, and they become the spokesperson for the American taxpayer who's picking up the bill for all this.
Michael Berg, let me ask you, Howard just discussed the idea of the indemnity agreement. Now, what this actually means is that when a contractor, a defense contractor working for the Pentagon, commits a crime. Now, let me just tell you how extreme this can be. The crime can be murder. Mm-hmm. The crime can be an intentional act that arises to the conduct of murder. And they're still given an indemnity protection. You remember when Blackwater got into the problems, they actually murdered people, and they were saying, well, gee, we can murder people because we have an indemnity contract. Right. Is there any area of the law or any area of culture or otherwise that we say, yeah, you can murder somebody, and if you do, the government is going to step in and protect you, and the government is going to, the government's even going to pay your legal fees, and they're going to pay any kind of civil fees that you may have? Can you think of any setting where that's ever happened?
You know what has to happen here is that the Justice Department has to prosecute to the full extent of the law. We have to have the president, and we cannot let them get away with this. There is no basis to allow this. and the American people have to go to their senators. This is very important. We can't let these corporations run wild with these crazy secret indemnity agreements and be allowed to murder people, to lie to them, to kill our troops, which with the KBR incident. And we need to have a Justice Department that is active and going after these people and putting them in jail. And once we do that, then we can stop it. Without that, I think that this is going to continue on and on and on, as you and Howard have talked about.
Guys, isn't that the only way to change the culture of crime? You don't do that by slapping them on the wrist. You don't do that by making them pay money. They're used to paying big money. Isn't what you do here is you do it by throwing people in jail. The truth is, I remember when even Ronald Reagan was confronted with the S&L scandal out of Texas, that 600 bankers went to jail. Nevertheless, on Wall Street, this is a very close parallel to what we've been talking about here, where you have a Department of Justice that seems completely unwilling to throw a guy in a three-piece suit with a Rolex watch and an Armani suit in prison, but we can throw everybody else in prison. So that's kind of what we have to overcome if we're ever going to change the culture of crime on Wall Street, or if we're going to change the culture of crime with the defense contractors that are stealing us blind with absolutely no downside. Mike Berg and Howard Nations are both past presidents of the National Trial Lawyers Association. We'll be talking about topics like this every week. We want you to tune in. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Howard.
Mike.
Thank you.
Coming up, author Les Leopold is going to join us for a discussion about the gross compensation being awarded to Wall Street bankers who produce absolutely nothing of value for our economy. Stay tuned. We're going to be right back.
Tune into Free Speech TV for Democracy Now!, a national, independent, award-winning news program bringing you people and perspectives rarely seen on corporate media.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Bankers and hedge fund managers on Wall Street produce absolutely nothing for the American economy. They don't make phones, they don't make cars, they don't make anything that consumers can actually buy or use. All they do is move money from one place to another and make millions of dollars in the process. Joining me now to talk about how Wall Street bankers are ripping off Americans is Les Leopold, author of the new book, How to Make $1 Million an Hour. Les Leopold, in 2010, the top hedge fund manager earned as much in an hour as a family, a median income family, earned in 47 years. Does that tell us that we're in trouble?
Big trouble. Actually, that's why I wrote the book, How to Make $1 Million an Hour. That was exactly the problem I was trying to dissect. How is that possible? How can someone earn that much money? And it seems to me answering that question would open up a great window into inequality in America. And what I found out was that it's very hard to justify making that much money compared to the rest of us. So the story I'm trying to uncover is, how do they do it, and why do we let them get away with it?
Les, before we get to that question, how did we get here? How did we get to the point to where we have a culture and we have a system that allows that type of disparity? Actually, your book is excellent on following the money, so to speak, where you talk about the top 25 hedge fund managers in 2010 earned as much as 650,000 entry-level teachers. That is a staggering number when you put it into perspective. How in the hell did we get here?
Well, we basically unlearned all the lessons of the New Deal. We took our foot, to be blunt about it, we took our foot off the neck of Wall Street. The only way to prevent our system from crashing and to prevent inequality from going wild is to regulate Wall Street austerely. I mean, to really regulate them hard. That's what we learned during the Great Depression. We learned to avoid another crash, we had to do everything we could to make Wall Street a sleepy place to work, not a vibrant, caffeine-filled casino. And we did that very well for about 40 years. And then a new generation kind of came in the mid-'70s and said, you know what, I think we should deregulate. I think we should get the government out of industry, and especially out of finance, because wonderful things will happen. The economy will boom. All boats will rise if we could just deregulate everything, cut taxes on the wealthy, and let money do what it's supposed to do.
In other words, we came after the crash in '29. We said, yeah, we need things like Glass-Steagall. We've got to have an SEC. We have to do things that slow this process down to where, as you point out, it does become kind of a sleepy little part of New York as opposed to this testosterone-filled crazy house that we've now invented. So what is it that made us forget? How did we get from, look, we almost lost it totally in 1929. In fact, we did. And how did we forget that?
Well, it's a complex story, but a lot of things were going on in the mid-1970s that made people question basic Keynesian economics. We had a war that was going on and on. We had bases all over the world dealing with the Cold War. We had an economy that got partially crippled by the Arab oil boycott. Things looked out of control. So there was a school of thought led by Milton Friedman and his Chicago school that said, look, the best way to deal with things is just get the government completely out of the economy. And a lot of people at that point were questioning government because it looked like it was doing a lot of crazy things anyway. So there was an opening. There was a vacuum, and that vacuum got filled by ideologues who basically assumed that the more you got the government out of the way, the better the economy would do. And it just turned out that they were wrong. All boats did not rise. There's an incredible chart that I came across that's in the book that shows the average wage basically on Wall Street versus the rest of the economy. And from 1929 to 1980, the two lines are exactly the same. If you worked in Wall Street or you worked in the regular economy, you'd earn about the same. After we deregulated, the top line shot straight up. That's Wall Street. And everybody else stayed flat. So what we did by deregulating was we just literally poured money into the hands of the few. And once you do that, you get a casino. And once you have that casino, it's going to
Les,
crash.
let me ask you, you've had some great ideas over the years that I've been following your career. I think you've probably done the most capable job that I've seen trying to say there's a resolution to all this. And one thing you proposed was, why is it that we allowed these trillions of dollars in transactions to take place on Wall Street, but there are no taxes? Why is it that in the UK, for example, they've been taxing these transactions for 300 years, and why most parts of Europe there is some tax that attaches to these events? Talk about that a little bit.
Right. The problem we have is Wall Street finance is way too big compared to the rest of the economy. It's sucking up this enormous amount of money, and then it kind of borrows against itself, so it sucks up more money. And you have to shrink down the size of Wall Street. The best way to do that is put a sales tax on what they do. There's a sales tax on virtually everything else in the country except the buying and selling of stocks, bonds, derivatives, futures, and all these kinds of things. A very small sales tax would start to shift money from Wall Street to Main Street. And if we don't do that, we're all going to be working for Wall Street. We're basically going to be paying hidden taxes again and again to Wall Street. You know, right now, I found out something recently. This one will blow your mind. That Wall Street gets to borrow money at a lower rate than smaller banks around the country because it is built in. Investors know that we're going to bail them out the next time around. And do you know how big that subsidy is? That subsidy is $300 billion a year.
Well, let me ask you. Let me ask you again. I've people who have followed this issue have followed your career, and it was almost as if after you came out with your last book, there was a feeling that, well, surely in Washington, at least this President Obama, is going to recognize the need to get involved. The need to hold this industry guilty when they are guilty. The need to, if they have to be perp walked, to perp walk them. The need to change the culture of criminality on Wall Street. But I think the truth is, nothing's further from the truth. In the end, it didn't land like that at all. What do you think that means for the next 5 or 6 years?
Well, I think we're in serious trouble. I don't know when the next crash is going to happen. I can't predict that, but I can tell you this for sure. We will bail out the largest financial institutions again and again and again because we've let them grow even bigger. They're much bigger now than they were before the crash. And the reason that the Obama administration and the Democrats didn't do what we thought that they ought to do was the rest of us weren't mobilized. It took a populist movement in the 1880s to actually build up to do something about finance. It took a progressive movement and then a labor movement and then a civil rights movement to actually make change in this country. You're not going to make change just by letting the politicians do it on their own. Occupy Wall Street taught us one thing, that if you want to change the conversation in this country, you do have to have mass demonstrations. And until something like that happens again, I don't know what form it's going to take, until we have a populist movement that aims directly at Wall Street, we're going to be paying the dues again and again.
Les, let me ask you something. You're one of those people who, first of all, said that what happened last time as far as the burn down was inevitable in your early writings. And then you're saying now, if I'm reading you right, that just get ready because it's going to happen again. Tell me, did I get that right?
Yeah, because we didn't make any fundamental changes. Unlike 1929, the New Deal actually did things that were going to constrain Wall Street. They did turn it into a sleepy place. We've done virtually nothing. And therefore, the same forces are at play, which is we have banks that are too big to fail. They're not going to, if you think that they've reformed themselves, then, please share whatever meds you're on, because they're not going to reform themselves. If they can make money by gambling, they're going to gamble, and they're gambling right now. One of the reasons Robert Reich, the former Secretary of Labor, wrote, he says, look, one of the reasons they're not investing in the economy is they make more money in their casinos. And as I've been saying more recently now, is that actually casino is not the right word, because casinos imply a certain amount of fairness. You know the odds. They don't play that way. They play in a rigged casino. So they're going to win their bets until something catastrophic happens. And at that point, they're going to turn to the government and say, oops, I'm sorry, we made some big mistakes here. What are you going to do about it?
Many writers actually say that the casinos are more regulated than Wall Street. There probably is a great deal of truth to that. What will cause the next burn down? What are the elements that will cause the next burn down? If you could quickly run through that in the next minute and a half.
There's so many weak points. I don't know where to start. It could happen. It'll happen from the place that we least expect it. But here are some possibilities. There's all this high frequency trading going on. Something like 50 to 80% of all the shares on the stock market are being traded automatically by high frequency computers that make millions of trades in a minute. Now, all it takes are a few programs to go wild, and if that happens at the end of the day, you could have a panic that's spread around the country where you'd have a crash of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 points in the stock market virtually in a matter of moments. That's a very vulnerable system. There's no, they try to put circuit breakers in and things like that to stop it from happening, but it's very difficult to control. That's one area. Bubbles, just asset bubbles. The stock market going up too fast. Another asset that we're not even thinking about right now starts becoming a casino play. The point is that finance, unregulated finance, is prone to crashes. There were no financial crashes when we controlled Wall Street. There was one in 40 years in Brazil in 1964. There are 178 since.
Okay. Les, we're out of time. Thank you for joining me today. Les Leopold, honestly, one of the best minds to follow where it comes to understanding what's happening to us at the hands of Wall Street. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
Les Leopold is the author of the new book, How to Make $1 Million an Hour. When we come back, we'll be taking a look at the industry and regulatory failures that allowed a faulty medical device to make it onto the market. I'm Mike Papantonio, and we'll be right back with more Ring of Fire.
You're watching Free Speech TV, a network powered by the people.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. The traditional mainstream media does a poor job telling the story of how faulty medical devices and drugs make it onto the market. The part of this story they miss is that these companies routinely put profits over the safety of their patients, and they rush to put their faulty products on the market to beat their competitors. This means we get products that haven't been properly tested or studied at all sometimes. Joining me now to discuss one of the latest products that's ruining the lives of American consumers is attorney Daniel Nye. Daniel, the latest, it seems like every week now we're seeing a product recall of some type. This one is the Stryker recall. Tell us what the Stryker recall is and how serious it is.
That's right, Pap. This is a very serious recall. Actually, they announced the recall July 6, 2012. But they're Stryker's finally meeting with surgeons to actually release the recall and let patients know that their product's been recalled. So at this point, 20,000 patients across the U.S. have received one of two products that have been recalled by Stryker. First is the Stryker Rejuvenate. It's a femoral stem implant, and another one is the ABG2 femoral stem implant.
What is the defect? I mean, every time there's a recall, we hear bits and pieces about the defect. What's the problem here? How is it harming people?
Right, here's the issue. When these products first come out, the idea is these surgeons have this wish list that they would like to try to make surgeries easier. So for these Stryker Rejuvenate, surgeons said that they would like to have a more modular stem. And so what the companies, the manufacturers then do is they come up with these quick fixes. And without engineering or testing the fixes or seeing how they actually work inside of a patient, they then release the product. So here, they release this product which they call a modular stem. So they've got a small little component that goes inside of the femoral stem, and this extra modularity caused all sorts of cobalt and chromium to shed off that modular point in the product.
Okay, let me back up here just a little bit. First of all, everybody watching this program, we believe that the FDA actually watches over us on products like this. Didn't the FDA test this? Didn't the FDA do their due diligence before this product was put on the market?
No, absolutely not. There's two ways which products get to the market. The first one is the pre-market approval, which is what most people think of, and that is you get to the market and you actually have to prove to the FDA that your product works. And so you show them clinical trials and you show them all sorts of tests that have been conducted on the product. What most people don't realize is that over 90% of these hip implant products that are on the market never received a pre-market approval. What they actually have is what's known as a 510K approval. And in fact, the FDA doesn't call it approval because they don't want to call it as such. It's just clearance. And they allow these manufacturers to market these products by saying their product is substantially similar to another product on the market. They get a rubber stamp and off they go and they get to clear these products and start marketing them on the market.
So in other words, if you believe that, in other words, people believing that this product that the doctor's getting ready to put in somebody's body has been thoroughly checked and it's been checked off on by the FDA, you're just absolutely wrong. Did I get that right?
That's right. It's just completely wrong. They haven't been tested anything compared to what we think they are. And in fact, what happens then is the company goes and aggressively markets it as if it has been a new tried, proven technology. But what we know is it's completely false.
Let me ask you this, Daniel. You talked about the types of physical problems that are attached to this product. You mentioned cobalt and chromium being something that can, I suppose, affect the human body. Explain that and explain what that has to do with the implant.
Right. Well, these cobalt and chromium ions are shed from the product itself and they go out into the body. And there's two things which we think about when we think about injuries to a person. First off, those cobalt and chromium ions, they can get out into the bloodstream and travel to all your other organs in the body. And scientists are still unsure just how bad of a problem this may cause to a person's heart, brain, thyroid, certain other issues that are still being investigated today, which of course, we should have those answers before people have these products put in them and they're guinea pigs with these cobalt and chromium ions. But the second thing is the local injuries around the hip implant. It's well proven, well documented that people with these high levels of cobalt and chromium ions in their body are having all sorts of tissue necrosis around the hip implant. They're having bone deterioration.
When you talk about tissue necrosis, that is just the tissue that's rotting away, isn't it?
That's right. When surgeons open this up, they see in there, they see black, dead, dying tissue. In fact, I've heard them describe it as dog food, coffee grinds, all other sorts of things, which is completely unnatural for the human body.
So with this necrosis, then it sounds like the other part of it is that it's one thing to recall the product, but then this isn't like recalling an automobile where you simply have to change a timing belt. What does the doctor have to do to get this hip implant out of the patient to be able to put something legitimate in?
That's exactly right. The first thing it takes is once they have these high levels of cobalt and chromium detected in the body, or they're having significant pain from the prosthesis, first thing they're going to have to do is they're going to have the product revised. And what we know about revisions is just revisions in general is already more difficult than the initial hip implant. But on top of that, they've got all these issues that they have to deal with the metallosis. So that means they have to clear out all that dead, dying tissue, saw away all that deteriorated bone, and it's a much more difficult revision. But on top of that, the most difficult part of the entire procedure is, and what's unique about the Stryker femoral stem from all the other hip implants that we've seen out there, is that the femoral stem is well fixed in the femur and it has to come out. In fact, surgeons have described this as rebar inside of cement. It is that hard in there, and that stem has to come out, which generally means the surgeon's either going to have to saw inside of that femur to get it out, or he's going to have to break the femur itself to get it out, and then he's going to have to wrap around cables around it and put screws into that femur just to try to keep that thing back in place.
Why do we, let's talk about the political and social issues of this. Why do we keep seeing product after product? I would say, I don't know how long you've been practicing, but I would say probably in your career, you've probably seen 20 recalls the same caliber of severity as this. Why does this keep happening?
Well, the biggest reason is because it takes nothing to essentially get the product on the market, that 510K rubber stamp, and they get a product on the market. The orthopedic manufacturers are not known for testing their devices before they enter it in the market, and they aggressively, market the product as if it's God's gift to mankind, but it really does nothing.
Let me ask you, Daniel. We keep hearing about this idea of industry capture. That is where the industry has their people working for the FDA, and the FDA comes out and when a scientist leaves the FDA, they end up going to work for industry. So it's this revolving door, and with this revolving door, how does anything ever really change? Because all the people involved, directly or indirectly, work for the industry. How do we solve that?
Well, that's right. I mean, the other unfortunate side of everything is that much of the scientific research, and probably 90% of the scientific research out there on orthopedic devices, and we see the same thing with pharmaceuticals, is that they're controlled by industry. And so we're not getting good science because the dollars are clearly driven to promote these products. What we will also see is we will see that when there's bad research, in other words, research that doesn't promote the product, they do away with the journal or the study altogether. So I think the number one thing that we need to do is that when a study starts, it needs to end, and that study needs to be published regardless of who's paying for it.
Daniel, I always tell people that ask about this topic, I tell them under no circumstances should they use a product, whether it's a pharmaceutical or an implant, any medical product, they should never use a product unless it's been on the market at least 10 years. Do you agree, or is that overstatement?
No, it's not overstatement at all, Pap. What we see is that with the metal-on-metal fiasco, there was a product on the market called metal-on polyethylene, well proven, well documented, and we saw that it was a great product. But then everybody started switching over to this metal-on-metal. It wasn't on the marketplace for not even 5 years, and all sorts of traffic was being driven to it, and we saw all sorts of revisions from it.
Daniel,
Next
you hear constantly the pharmaceutical industry and the medical device industry whining that they have to spend so much money for product development. That's just purely a lie, isn't it? The money that they spend doesn't have to do with developing the product. It simply has to do with marketing, where the numbers are 70 to 80% of all this money the industry says they're spending actually is spent on marketing the product. So tell me about the marketing plan for Stryker.
Well, that's completely right. 70-80% is spent on marketing the product, and then the other 20 to 30%, which we talk about journals and research, that's just another form of marketing as well for most of those dollars. Here with Stryker, what we saw is that Stryker actually employed some of the same employees that used to work at DePuy. And those same employees that...
Well, why is that important? DePuy was also recalled, correct?
Right. The DePuy ASR had over 33,000 implants that were recalled, and they were aggressively marketed by a guy named Paul Berman. Paul Berman left DePuy after the recall, and he went to go work for Stryker Orthopedics. And what do we see in 2011? Aggressively marketed Stryker Rejuvenate. Paul Berman, the vice president of marketing, yet again markets another failed product, aggressively markets it, and Stryker Rejuvenate sees its highest boom in sales in 2011, the year before the recall.
And there's no question, all the people at Stryker had to do was look at the dishonest approach that this Berman was using to market DePuy, and they would have said, well, we certainly don't want them working for our company, but they hired him anyway, right?
That's right. If they had just looking at any of the surgeons' feedback that had worked with Paul Berman, especially those ones that had complained about the product, they would have realized that Paul Berman squashed those complaints and tried to make it to where the public never heard about them. And so I'm certain we're going to see the same thing with Stryker Rejuvenate as soon as we start getting the discovery of those documents.
What is Stryker doing in about a minute? Just sum up. What is Stryker doing right now to keep people from bringing lawsuits? I mean, they've got to do something. You agree they can't keep this in their body, so something has to happen. What is the industry doing to prevent them from doing that?
Well, they've actually hired this claims company called Broadspire. It's the same company that was hired to handle the DePuy ASR recall. Broadspire's offered to pay for out-of-pocket medical expenses and lost wages, but essentially what we're seeing is they're wanting to get these patients to sign a release, and that release gives Stryker the rights to the prosthesis in the event that they do have a revision. That's a big no-no. You don't want the key piece of evidence laying in the hands of the defendant for them to be able to test that product first.
And they're not paying these people for any future pain and suffering, any problems, is that right?
Right. No future pain and suffering, no loss of earning capacity, nothing on punitive damages.
Just another scam if you really drill down. Daniel Nye is an attorney handling cases against Stryker. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Pap.
That's it for this week, but you can get more Ring of Fire online at ringofireradio.com. I'm Mike Papantonio, and we'll see you next week on Ring of Fire.
You're witness to a political coup taking place right in front of your damn eyes. That caliber of evil needed to be held accountable in courtrooms. Billionaire mad money wasn't enough to buy democracy. Legislators don't have enough sense to think for themselves. They let Alec do it.
Here at Ring of Fire, the truth is our only agenda, so we're able to bring you the stories that mainstream media just ignored or completely got wrong.